So I look forward very much indeed for Michael's address to us. Michael.
Bruce, I'm really grateful for that brief introduction. Some of the worst moments of my life have been introductions. I was recently introduced by a chief constable, I was going to say remain nameless, but it was Warwickshire actually, to a police audience, and he said, now we have Michael Bichard, who of course is well known to the police. And the amazing thing was he was the last person in the room who realised what he said, but there we are. We are, as Bruce said at the beginning, we're facing quite extraordinary challenges. Some might even say, although we tend not to use this word in government, we're facing a crisis. And traditionally, I guess, we've approached crises by trying to make ourselves more efficient, trying to increase our productivity, trying to defer projects that don't really need to be done. I think my argument now is that that's not going to be good enough. This crisis is going to last a long time, and it's pretty profound. And I think it calls for us to address what is nothing less than a transformation of government and of the civil service. If you think back to certainly the last 20 years, what words have caricaturized government and the civil service? I think they're words like control, centralization, specialization, targets, regulation, structural reform. And I think that you could sum them up by saying that's all about managing for compliance. Some say it's about ticking boxes. And I think the change that we're looking for now is moving from managing for compliance to managing for value. And that's a big shift. But we often talk about these things in very broad terms, and people go away thinking, well, what the hell does that actually mean? I mean, what are the real changes that we're looking to achieve, and what are the new skill sets that we need to acquire as civil servants, or the skill sets that we need to develop? So in the time I've got, I just want to talk about, I'm going to talk about 8, very briefly, skills that I think are going to be really, really critical as we move forward. You will have noticed no slides. I'm sorry about that. You have to look at me, which is a double disadvantage. The first thing I want to say is that we've got to be better at building partnerships. We need to build partnerships to improve policy. Why do I say that? Because most of the big social problems and economic problems that we face don't fit neatly into our particular bureaucratic boxes. But we do often, if we're honest, work in silos. And we need to learn better how to build partnerships across departments, across levels of government, and as I shall go on to say, with a wider community. Not only because current economic and social problems don't fit into bureaucratic boxes, but also because the big problems that are coming down the track certainly don't. If you think about chronic health conditions, if you think about an aging population, if you think about the environment and climate change, these don't fit into anyone's bureaucratic box. And we've got to learn to build partnerships better to provide better policy. But we also need to build partnerships to deliver services better. I've looked at one or two areas in England recently, and one of the things that's really striking is how individual clients, families, are actually receiving services from 6 or 8 different agencies, different government departments, different local agencies, with no effective coordination of the support. And what happens, of course, is that wastes a lot of public money, but it also leaves the client, the family, completely bemused and confused, not sure which support worker is going to walk through the door next. We need to build better partnerships too to save money. Frankly, we haven't been very good at that, I don't think. There's £220 billion a year spent in the UK public sector on goods and materials. Well over 100 billion of that is on materials, goods that we all use, energy, for example, paper at a very basic level. But certainly in England, there's no real convincing public sector purchasing strategy. And there always seemed to me, when I was in the public sector, there seemed to be good reasons, more reasons not to purchase jointly than there were to work together. I know one of your later sessions today is on sharing services. The same applies there. Why? I think if we're honest, too often because of our territoriality and our sense of sovereignty, We do it here this way, and that's how we are going to do it. We can't afford the luxury of territoriality when we're facing the kind of crisis that we're facing. And the final area where I think we need to be better at building partnerships is with the wider community. Certainly in England, the rhetoric has long supported this. It's been about working with the third sector, the voluntary sector, what's now known as the civil society. But I think the rhetoric's been more convincing than the reality. And often I don't think we have developed a real partnership with the community, the communities. And sometimes when I've gone into government departments in Whitehall, I've left feeling that this was all a bit like their equivalent of corporate social responsibility. It was a nice thing to have, but it wasn't going to change the world. Well, actually, facing the crisis that we're facing, I think we do need to make sure that every resource in every community is brought to bear on the social problems that we should be addressing. And that means developing genuine partnership with the wider communities. And all of that means that for civil servants, we just need to kind of think, well, have we got the right skill sets? Very good at control in the past, very good at prescribing, but are we as good at building and sustaining coalitions? Do we really engender trust? Are we good at influencing and negotiating with our partners? Are we good at creating a sense of common purpose and direction? Do we engage different departments, different levels of government and the wider community in the co-design of policy? That's a very practical thing that we need to change. We need to be better at building partnerships. We need to be better also at commissioning outcomes. The history of the public sector, if you think about it, has been about delivery. We deliver services, ultimately, to people who need support and need, often, state help. And we've developed some very big empires and armies to do the delivery. I used to run one of them. I ran the benefits agency for 5 or 6 wonderful years. I actually mean that. There's no hint of irony there. The fact is, though, that because of all that, I think our focus sometimes has been too much on managing the inputs and not enough on achieving the desired outcomes. So I think we now need to become better at commissioning outcomes and more prepared to countenance others providing services for the public good and managing those providers effectively. But when I look around, I still think commissioning skills are in short supply, and I still think sometimes that we exclude potential new providers from the market by the extreme bureaucracy in the procurement process and our determination to specify in too much detail how outcomes are to be provided. That's the second thing, commissioning outcomes. The third thing is, I think we need to develop a capacity to design services, not structures. If you have a huge increase in investment and that fails to deliver the expected results, which is actually the reality of the last decade or so, most organisations would look pretty hard at their business model. Well, we don't do that. In the public sector, we tend to reorganise the structure. In England, we must by now have exhausted just about every possible structure for health, education and local government, or maybe not on current evidence. But redesigning the structure, whisper it gently, rarely delivers improved performance. I am chairman of the Design Council at the moment. I see a lot of designers firsthand. They're fantastic. Do you know what they do? They design products and services around the client and the customer. They make sure they're functional, i.e. they work. They make sure they're accessible, they're seamless, they're affordable, and they look good, otherwise people wouldn't want them. You contrast that to many of our public services, which are fragmented and frankly confused. We don't talk about service design enough in the public sector. We talk about policy implementation. But we ought to talk about service design because poorly designed services, however much money you throw at them, they don't deliver quality. And we have a lot of poorly designed services which have had a lot of money thrown at them, which have improved the quality to some extent, but have not achieved a transformation. If we take that money away, those poorly designed services are going to be a real problem. The fourth thing I think we need to do, we need to be better at influencing people and their behaviour. Difficult territory, this. But we've got to find some way of preventing future demand on our services. If obesity, if diabetes, if chronic heart disease continue to grow at the current rate, actually the pressure on our future services is going to be unsustainable. The cost of that will even dwarf the current financial crisis. So we need to understand and use better the science of behavioural economics so that we're more effective at influencing people's lifestyle and their behaviour. And we need to find new ways, I think, of incentivising prevention. You know, we haven't been very good at prevention. I sometimes think that's partly because we've got so many different organisations that often the organisation that should be investing in prevention will not be the organisation that benefits financially in the future. Well, we need to look at ways in which we can manage that more effectively, things like social impact bonds. We've got to influence lifestyles, we've got to invest more in prevention, and particularly, I think, in early intervention. We've also got to make government more innovative. Bruce touched on this at the beginning. It's not the prevailing culture. There's some fantastic examples, let's not forget, of innovation in government. But it isn't the prevailing culture. And faced with a crisis, many people instinctively look to defend what they've got. They look to protect the status quo. They don't see this as a time to try new things because money is short and pressure is on. But we're not going to get through this by doing the same old things in the same old way, producing much the same old results. We've got to innovate. And what we as leaders, and all of you are in leadership positions, what we need to understand is that we have quite a big impact on whether our team, our people, our organisation, our department actually are able to innovate. We need to provide the right example. When someone comes to you with a new idea, the response is not, no, we tried that in 1948 and it didn't work then. You know, you can set the right example. You can eliminate a lot of these narrow process targets which stop people using their initiative. You can reward successful innovators, manage risk more effectively, get rid of needless paper and meetings, don't interfere too much in perfectly good reports, involve the front line. And I think both speakers have touched on this. We need to find better ways of involving all of our staff. I go into government departments, they can always take me to a really good example of frontline involvement. They might call it lean, they might call it coaching for performance, they might call it Quest. It's there, but it isn't the way that department does things right across the piece every day of the week. Involving the front line should be a culture, and it isn't yet. That's about also, the sixth thing I want to say is about devolving power. It's about devolving power to liberate the potential, not just of the front line, but of local government and of communities. And that means devising new forms of accountability. Anyone who's tried to devolve power in their team or in their organisation knows how difficult that is. It isn't about abdication. It isn't about anarchy. It is about articulating the extent of the new power and the limitations and building capacity so that people can use that power effectively. We've got to be better at devolution and managing it. And the last two things I want to touch on, well, one you'll say is old hat, motherhood and apple pie, but it is so important. We need to be better at realising the potential of technology. Government hasn't always found this easy. Governments haven't always found this easy. And too often, I think technology has been used merely to improve processing activity. Technology, and especially in the future mobile technology, can and should transform the shape of our public services. It can and should save us money. It can and it should increase accessibility to all of our services. But it only will do that if we integrate it into the design of policy and services right at the outset. It'll only do it if we ensure that technology is driven by the business and is not allowed to drive the business. And it'll only do it if we involve the people who are going to use the technology in its design and implementation. I think, and I hope I don't offend too many people in the audience, we need a new breed of IT advisors in government capable of playing a central part in the conversation, in the debate about reshaping policy and services. And the final thing I think we need to be better at, I think we need to find better ways of facilitating self-help in our communities. I sense in England at the moment that the coalition are a bit embarrassed about talking about self-help. There's nothing wrong in helping people to help themselves when they want to. It can actually lead to those people feeling they've met their needs more effectively than any of us can, and it can save money. Yet we've made it incredibly difficult, I think, for people to help themselves. I've got friends with children with learning difficulties who seem to spend a huge amount of their time reinventing the wheel. People with very elderly parents who seem to invest vast amounts of their time bringing together care packages for 93, 94-year-olds who can't do it themselves. We've made it very difficult with our complex bureaucracy, our excessive procedures, and the way in which we involve countless organisations. We've got to support, we've got to encourage people who help themselves with better, more transparent information, with better management of knowledge so that people can use knowledge and experience for their own good, and support those who want to establish new forms of self-help organisations and social enterprises. All of that is a long way from 20th century government, talking about building partnerships, talking about influencing behaviour, talking about designing services, talking about self-help. This is very different from the government that we've been used to in the recent past. It is, as I said at the beginning, not about managing for compliance. It is about managing for value. And why is that so important? Because when you haven't got a lot of money, when resources really are constrained, we have got to make sure that every single pound we invest is invested for value, not to please some inspector or tick some box. It's got to be about adding value. Thanks very much.